Now let's really understand the impact of narcissistic abuse on our different aspects of our existence, of our being, and not just the psychological, but also physical and other aspects. And let's begin with the psychological, emotional, and I guess, missed the word, which is neurological. Excuse me. The impact of the abuse on our brain. We'll be talking about the brain injury, which is again an exciting topic for me to talk about. We'll be talking about how it changes us as a person and how it gives birth to the different adaptations that I was talking about. Why and how and where does these uh, changes happen? Before we understand that, let's try to understand the brain a little bit. Of course, this is not going to be an anatomy class where I'll talk about the complex stuff. Of course not. I'll keep it simple. So imagine that this is your brain, and imagine that it's like a staircase, okay? So we have a couple of steps on the staircase. We have mainly three steps. We have the brain stem, we have the midbrain, and then we have the upper brain, okay? These are the three main surface levels that we can divide our brain into. And each level performs a different function. It does a different thing for us. For example, the upper region of our brain, which is cortex, that is a part that is responsible for rational thinking, creativity, the perception of time, feeling hopeful. Okay. And then this is the part that we use for executive functioning. This is the part when we have access to it, when it is going on, we are able to discern between what has happened and what is happening. Just understand that what I just said is very, very important for us to remember in terms of why the triggers happen and why the flashbacks happen. So when this is online, we are able to differentiate between what has happened and what is happening in the moment. And then if we go a little bit down in the second layer of the brain, which is again limbic system, where the amygdala lies, the hippocampus, diencephalon, and other structures, these are the midbrain mainly processes the perception of reward, memory, bonding, sleep, and appetite. And ultimately, if we go to the lower part of the brain, which is the brain stem, which in other words, we call as the reptilian brain. The interesting thing to understand is as we walk down the staircase, our functionality decreases. As we walk down the staircase, the things that we can do become limited. For example, if your cortical region is down, it's not functioning, all you can experience is the feelings. All you can feel is the panic, the anxiety, without being able to differentiate between what has happened and what is happening now. And that is what a panic attack is. When you have the panic attack, your cortex is not online, so you cannot be in the present moment and kind of differentiate between what has happened and what is happening. And then let's say our brain stem is what is dominant, or it has become oversensitive, or it is the part of the brain that stays active and the other parts are inactivated. And I'll talk about that, what that means and how does that happen. But let's say that all we have access to is the brain stem in our brain, and brain stem is responsible for all processes that regulate the basic functions in our body, such as temperature regulation. It keeps an internal check, and it just happens beyond and below your conscious awareness, because your body doesn't come to you and ask you, okay, I'm going to regulate the temperature now. No, it doesn't do that. It does it on its own. It regulates respiration, it regulates digestion, it regulates the nervous system. Basically, what happens is that it doesn't have any sense of time, which means any information that it processes, all it scans for is whether there is an element of danger in it or not, or does it match with something that could be a threat to this person. And if it does, it cannot differentiate between, okay, is it happening or has it happened? It just sees a resemblance, and then the things happen. And we'll talk about this further in the part where I explain how to deal with triggers and why triggers happen at the first place. So what I'm trying to say here is, in the narcissistic relationship, because of constant devaluation, idealization, manipulation, gaslighting, subtle abuse that is visible or subtle, or that is covert, or that is chronic, we are exposed to an overwhelming amount of threat and stress. Our brain is literally fried because all the time we stay in a state of hypervigilance, because we are worried about, if you're trauma bonded, we are worried about they will leave you and you just want to stay with them. You want to restore the homeostasis of the relationship, and you just have to keep trying. You have to just keep giving in. You have to be hyper vigilant, always being worried about how to fight the situation, which means that your system is being exposed to an extreme amount of stress. And when your system is exposed to an extreme amount of stress, our brain switches on the survival state. We are put in a survival state where we lose the executive evolved functioning. We face difficulty in making decisions. All we feel is panic. All we feel is that we are going to get attacked in one or the other way. All we are prepared is for the narcissist's rage. All we do is we react. We either fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. That is what we are reduced to as humans, because the stress is never ending. And as that happens constantly, consistently, our brain rewires itself slowly in different regions, and I'll be naming them, in a way that it makes the adaptation long lasting. It kind of prepares us, I wouldn't say permanently, but for a long term, to respond to the situation in a certain way, in a certain adaptive way. And because of this alteration, our functioning starts to change. Let me come to these alterations one by one for you to really understand in depth what I'm talking about. After narcissistic abuse, one of the things that happens is alteration in the perception of levels of reward and punishment. What that means in simple terms is, what we would perceive as reward or an action big enough for us to stay in the relationship, the perception of it changes. What that means is, slowly, after the love bombing phase, the narcissist starts demoralizing you, breaking you down, throwing in the breadcrumbs. And because of the nature of the complex abuse, you start settling for things. And ultimately, because of this process of patch up and break up, you get trauma bonded. With each repetition of the cycle of the trauma bond, or this break up, patch up, and leaving and getting back together, or being punished and then being nurtured by the narcissistic parent, the way we see reward changes. Some people start settling for the things that others would clearly see that they are not enough. And I have tons of examples to give you what happens basically. And these changes happen in the limbic system, the injury and the brain, the neural pathway alteration. I'm going to give you an example of a person who who experienced narcissistic abuse as a child from the mother's side. The mother was extremely neglectful, wouldn't pay attention, was always gaslighting the child and always blaming the child for the mistakes that were clearly not hers. It happened to the extent that the person was blamed for the sexual abuse that they went through. Basically, it was what was said when she talked with her mother was that you were imagining it, or maybe it didn't happen, or you caused it to yourself. Things like that, where the experience of this person were suppressed, the experiences, and they were gaslighted to begin with. And ultimately, the affection that they got from the caretaker was minimal. So because of this alteration, this abuse that we are put through, we start settling for things such as someone speaks nicely to us and we feel so good about it and we are ready to sacrifice ourselves. Someone does something small for us and we feel, so connected, and we mistake and misunderstand it, that they are godlike. And that is what also kind of plays a role in the narcissistic relationship dynamic, because narcissist love bombs you. And then if you already are primed to this abuse and the alteration has happened, you would settle for small things. Or specifically talking in terms of narcissistic romantic relationships, with the narcissist is each attempt of withdrawal, withholding love, and keeping distance and making you feel unsafe, you start settling for things such as, they could be withholding attention for a long time and you would be begging for it, and ultimately they say hi, or they show up online, or they say something, and you feel a rush of hormones in the body. You feel so connected, you feel so happy, as if your day is filled with colors and light. This is how we slowly change in such a relationship. This is the perception of what we perceive as a punishment or reward changes, and that happens in our limbic system. Alteration in the perception of threat. If we are constantly exposed to abuse and trauma, covert or overt, it could be physical violence, it could be hidden belittling wrapped in compliments, or any kind of abuse, we are like, a brain is attacked again and again and again, and because it has to adapt, and that causes again the changes in a brain. Most importantly, we talk about two structures, amygdala and hippocampus. Amygdala starts to, there is inflammation in it. And again, it's not a problem. Basically, what happens is it is an adaptation. The inflammation makes you more sensitive, or rather oversensitive to your environment. And that's why the triggering, it's very easy for you to get triggered, or the startle response is different, or you're oversensitive to the sounds in your surrounding, or someone looks a certain way, someone wears a certain perfume, and it sends you into a panic attack. I'm just giving you very overt examples, but the perception of threat starts to change. And then ultimately, if we talk about the alteration in sensory perception of bonding and attachment, again, we are talking about the limbic system. We are talking about what we perceive as bonding, what we feel and see as connection starts to change. That is where the trauma bonding comes in, because of the constant inconsistency in the narcissist's nature, because of up and down, high and low throughout the relationship. And with each, attempt of withdrawal and withholding and then breadcrumbing, our dopamine channels changed. Our brain releases different hormones, and I'll be talking about hormones separately, on when we are exposed to certain stimuli or certain experiences, and we have a threshold in our brain. And this threshold shrinks. And something as insignificant and as minor as a narcissist sending an emoji across can make you feel connected, and you may feel, okay, everything is okay, everything is fine. Maybe I was overthinking, and the cognitive dissonance that creates more confusion. But our alteration in the perception of bonding and attachment changes. And also, if we talk about the main patterns as childhood trauma survivors, the way we perceive attachment with others, it also changes. Maybe you can think about anxious attachment style, avoidant attachment style, disorganized attachment style, insecure type of attachment style. On the surface level, these may be seen as disorders, but deep down, there is an alteration, and there is a cause behind the alterations, how we perceive the bonding and attachment, how we connect with others. Alteration in perception of these sensations. Here comes the concept of window of tolerance, and I'll be talking about that separately in detail towards the later section. But when it comes to the alteration in the perception of sensations, our capacity to stay with sensations such as pain, emotional pain, sadness, or any kind of sensation, it shrinks, because what should be happening occasionally is happening consistently and constantly. And our body is not designed to stay in a state of fight, flight, freeze, or the stress, this survival state activation forever. It should be happening occasionally. And because of the opposite thing happening, our ability to stay with the emotions or the sensations shrinks. And that's why the body may completely cut off our ability to feel. Or in other cases, an emotion that could be a positive emotion, like an excitement. You may be feeling excited about something, and you suddenly start panicking without a reason. And I must tell you, if you are someone who experiences that, you are not broken. You are not damaged, as it may feel like. Because I was one of those people who would have massive social anxiety at events where others would be completely calming. Maybe a part of it is my personality, but a major part of it was this alteration, the shrinking and the narrowing down of my window of tolerance. So the perception of sensations also changes, specifically talking in terms of romantic narcissistic relationships or the narcissistic attachment, narcissistic parents, um, cutting the relationship, moving away, moving on, letting the narcissistic relationship or the narcissist go may feel like death. You may feel like it's the end of the world and there's no hope beyond it. There's nothing that is going to happen now. No good is going to come. Excuse me. Or I'm not going to survive it. Or the pain may be unbearable. It may even trigger suicidal ideation, about which we are going to talk about later. This is the changes that happen in our brain, alteration in consciousness and cognition. The way we think, it starts to change. We find ourselves constantly ruminating about things, constantly thinking about things, and that is where this overthinking comes from. Some people would just say, I'm an overthinker, but here it is where it comes from. Our brain changes and adapts in a way that it tries to indulge in preoccupied rumination, where you obsessively think about things that happened in the past. Just, it is an attempt where the brain is trying, your mind is trying to make sense of why that happened with you or what happened with me. And that is what the alteration is. And how our cognition changes, our thinking pattern changes, and how we see ourselves changes. The shame, the blame that we put on ourselves, the inner critic also is born here. It comes from this place. The way we see other people and how they relate with us, it also changes. Now, if we relate it all with the nervous system, we need to understand that once we are in the survival state, we lose complete access to our prefrontal cortex, which is able, or which enables the executive functioning. Executive functioning is simply being able to differentiate between what happened in the past and then bringing yourself in the present moment and knowing that the past is not replaying, it is a different person. May their actions or something may be similar, it is not the same thing happening. That is what executive functioning is. And as trauma survivors, because of the constant state of stress and constant domination of survival state, we lose access to it. And more blood flow is sent to the lower brain or brain stem, and there's the change in the brain structures that is again induced and caused by the nervous system dysregulation. Our nervous system has many parts and branches, and one of them is autonomic nervous system. Autonomic nervous system has two branches, parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. What I need you to know is that when the survival state is activated, the PNS is switched off. It's thrown out of the window, and SNS is activated or kept online for most of the time. SNS is the part of the nervous system that prepares you for fight, flight, or freeze, that makes the change in your brain, that induces the change in your body, that sends the alarm for the body to release all the stress hormones. And we are made to stay in that state of stress or SNS activation occasionally, because we are no more living in jungles. And what should be happening is PNS should be dominant most of the times. PNS, when parasympathetic nervous system is dominant, we are calm. We have access to our cortex. We can make rational decisions. We are not afraid of our sensations. We know that we can deal with the stress. That is what should be dominant. But in our case, the opposite happens. And that's why these alterations, and that's why these major changes, and ultimately it is all interconnected, as I'll bring it together later. But this alteration in our nervous system and brain ultimately leads to the physical and biochemical change in our body. Before we talk about that, let's understand some of the consequences of psychological and emotional changes. And these are the follows. We have rumination, as I said, flashbacks, visual or emotional, because all that is happening is brain is trying to resolve the memories that are stuck and not sequenced as any other normal memories. They're stuck in a deeper part of the brain and is just trying to bring them to the conscious level where you're trying to rationalize them. But because of the activation in the body, you are not able to come out of it. That's why you feel stuck within those emotions. That's why they never go away. That's why you have them. And that's why our body later adapts by either disconnecting us or suppressing those memories and emotions. Constant triggering. You know about that and how small and minor things can trigger us as survivors. Avoidance, and this is the most important part that I would like to talk about, as a consequence of these alterations in the brain and how we stay in the survival response for most of the time, because our body somehow has to cope with the stress ongoing that we fail to cope with. It activates extreme survival responses or adaptive responses, and one of them is avoidance. Avoidance is the brain tries to involve you, indulge you in activities, in things that are unhealthy for sure, but it is done with an attempt to protect you. And the examples could be drug addiction, overusage of alcohol, drinking problems, comfort eating, overeating, undereating, games, working too much, and cleaning. And there are so many examples that I can give you at this point for you to understand what our brain does to just cope, and how we naturally tend to go towards things that kind of soothe the pain or that creates the distance. Because if we are not internally able to create the distance, we use the external mechanisms and ways to cope in the situation. And one of the ways is by creating the distance through the substance use, through all of these usages, and that gives us some kind of relief. It's again, the drug is not the problem. The problem is the reason why you're forced to do that. Emotional dysregulation, negative concept, trauma bonding, and cognitive dissonance is also a result of these alterations that happen in our brain. And even though the chemical imbalance is also plays a role in the trauma bonding, which we'll talk about, but ultimately it is related with the structural changes in the brain injury that induces and causes the chemical imbalance, and that's why we feel trauma bonded at the first place.